Okay, just to announce very quickly, there is a millennial in the house, and he loves virtual reality. So that confirms the survey result. So everywhere we go nowadays, we meet up with robots, right? Okay, in the back office, we actually have the bots with numeric IDs working on the RPA. In the front office, we have chatbots with female names. Okay, I'm not sure why, but you know there has to be a gender diversity policy for Robo Sapiens too. And at the junior levels, we have bots. At the senior levels, we also have bots. A couple of years ago, I was talking to some stakeholders and I was telling them, if you want to ensure diversity on the board, you have to get a robot in your board. Right? And 1 year later, a company called Deep Knowledge in Hong Kong actually appointed Vital, a robot, to its board. It served as a non-executive director. So if you're an SGX listed company and you're looking for non-executive independent directors, just try some robots. But I'm not sure whether SGX or the CG rules allow you to actually appoint a robot, because I don't know whether they want directors of biological origin. Who knows, right? Now, recently the awareness of RPA has actually gathered a lot of speed. In the past 1 year, if you go to any conference, CFO conference or shared services conference, they will talk to you about RPA, but they don't tell you how it interacts with other technologies. So today, I think we have a very good opportunity to actually do that, because we have very, very diverse perspective from people who know blockchain and business model innovation, Industry 4.0, and so on and so forth. If you take the bot which is working in the back office, right? Give it some natural language processing skills, okay? And it can serve in the front office as a chatbot, right? And then if you're talking about the Internet of Things nowadays, there's an estimate that there are about 10 billion devices now connected to the Internet. And by 2020, there'll be 20 billion devices. Now consider RPA in an environment which is connected to this Internet of Things. What else can it do? What else can it execute? Not only the basic robot, but also the cognitive robot. And then if you're talking about blockchain, right? I recently read a paper by an MIT researcher who says that you can actually use the smart contracts which blockchain allows to control robots and swarms of robots. So, and a smart contract within blockchain also behaves, I think, like a robot. So maybe I'll ask Rolf to explain a little bit more about what smart contracts are and how smart contracts and process automation interact.
Sure. Smart contracts on the blockchain. So let me quickly say what a blockchain is. A blockchain is nothing more than essentially an Excel file, something that Timothy mentioned earlier, that essentially operates across organizations. And you can input different kinds of data into it, which connects to IoT and big data, right? You can sort of feed data into this file automatically. That's where RPA comes in. And smart contracts is nothing more than a macro in that Excel file. Now, what makes the smart contract different from a macro is that a macro in Excel is owned by Microsoft, right? Versus a smart contract is something that is not owned by anybody. It's typically open sourced, and it's a kind of computer program that runs publicly and very transparently through this Excel file to do all kinds of functions, whether that be auditing, whether that be listing, whether that be monitoring different kinds of data coming in and out of this, this fancy Excel file, which is decentralized and therefore distributed outside the organizations. Smart contracts are something that anybody can sort of typically access, at least for most kinds of blockchains. This is interesting because when you have steps where first you have to aggregate information into an Excel file, right? It's not really copying, pasting from a PDF and then sort of inputting that into the blockchain. It's simply something that you can do automatically through these billions of devices that are coming online, and a smart contract can sort of perform certain functions where the data is being transformed within the file, and where typically value is attached to this transformation, which is something that cannot otherwise be done.
So, I mean, a vending machine is like a smart contract, isn't it? A vending machine. That, maybe you can elaborate on that example.
So a vending machine is a smart contract.
What do you think? It basically executes the instructions.
Correct. I guess the difference between a smart contract and a vending machine is that a vending machine that is not connected to the internet wouldn't per se be something that we would refer to as a smart contract. Smart contract would be a set of if-then rules that says, you know, if you perform an action like throwing in a coin, it will push something out, it will produce some kind of output.
So if you do something, then it will do something else. So there is this interaction which occurs in smart contracts.
Yeah, it's a smart contract because it adapts on certain kinds of environmental conditions that sometimes it hasn't necessarily encountered yet. So a vending machine can only specify and do very specific things that you code in at the beginning. A smart contract can evolve over time as information sort of flows in.
So how smart can a smart contract be? I asked you this question earlier on because apparently smart contracts are just like robots. Are just like robots, right? Just executing whatever. No, it could be the IFRS that they are executing, right? If you have each financial reporting standard, you look at it as a smart contract, it will just execute whatever is in that FRS, right? So the question is, we were talking about cognitive, we're talking about RPA throughout the cognitive spectrum, right? Cognitive, of course, uses deep learning. Maybe Wendy, you can talk about it a little bit later. But just coming back to Rolf, now, what is the state of smart contracts now, and can it become smarter?
So I guess the first question, which is, what is the state of smart contracts today? We have one blockchain, which is a type of Excel that lots of people use it as open source, that has a valuation of $32 billion as of this morning, which is used a lot to create smart contracts. There are entire companies that are being put on this blockchain to operate in a completely decentralized manner. So no one has an office. All work is sort of deposited on this blockchain in the form of smart contracts, which you can link to each other. In fact, there's this thing called decentralized autonomous organizations. People want to put not just a process and automate that onto the blockchain. They want to put the entire organizational structure on the kind of blockchain. Can a smart contract become smarter? I think coming to machine learning, yes, it can. A smart contract can have a subsection which says, as information flows in over time, it will change certain types of pattern recognition behaviors that it didn't initially kind of have. I think that's one of the big advantages of having something like a smart contract, because it allows you both to have a sort of static framework as well as a framework that is dynamic and evolves over time, interacting with each other in a very simple way. So smart contracts, even though it sounds very smart, they actually operate in very simple ways. Really just if-then rules. You can have 5 if-then rules connected to each other. That's called a smart contract.
Right. So between basic RPA and cognitive RPA, right, why do we use the word cognitive? Because, because it uses machine learning, deep learning, right? What's the difference between, maybe Wendy can explain, what's the difference between deep learning and the narrow AI that we had previously?
So and Tim sort of touched upon this in his spectrum, right? And again, I like to sort of think about machines and the things that we're talking about. They're actually really dumb, right? They're like my children when they first grow up, right? You have to teach them. You have to teach them to actually recognize certain things. So at the moment, lots of machines can't actually recognize images, right? So again, when you go in your cloud and you've destroyed your phone, for example, they actually still use people to actually replicate the things and images that you actually have, because the machines can't actually recognize faces yet, but they're learning. So what happens again when we're doing visual analytics? We've actually put 10,000 images of what smiling looks like, and the more they look at, again, if you think about learning, they've actually then sort of say, now this is a smile, even though I'm Asian or Singaporean, or you're from the US and you're American. These facial features means that you've got a smile. So what is happening here at the moment when we think about RPA is that it's learned very simple things to do. Yes, no, maybe, right? If it's a maybe, it comes up to a referral for a human to actually intervene. But more over time with cognitive, you're going to see the fact that these machines are learning. That's where we talk about deep learning. We talk about effective computing. And again, effective computing is also where we're teaching our machines to actually be more human. Right, so we talk about chatbots, and we're talking about virtual assistants. And I've always asked myself, why do we need our machines to be more human? I actually don't really, I'm really happy to talk to a machine, right? I mean, but maybe it makes us feel more comfortable that we have machines that resemble us, and there has been actually work done, especially in healthcare, around how we actually relate better if it's actually again more human-like. But so in that spectrum, what we're seeing then is very simple, robotic, process automation. Not a lot of learning happening. All the way through to, again, where they're starting to mimic and they're starting to understand and starting to process. And that's what we actually mean about being more cognitive. Your child is waking up, but it comes from actually you teaching it lots and lots of things. And the power of the machine is that, for your child, it takes, a lifetime to actually understand a whole world of concepts. But again, with machines, it's overnight. Right, again, so that's the difference, and their ability to actually learn, and that's by seeing lots of things and then interpreting. You're helping it. New jobs are being created where humans are helping machines interpret what it is that they're seeing and say that's a frown. That might look like a grimace, it might look like a smile, but that's actually an angry look. Right? These are the things that we're actually sort of doing, and that's what deep learning and machine learning and cognitive is actually moving to.
Yeah, so deep learning is basically trying to mimic human thinking, right? In terms of reasoning, in terms of inferring, and of course you talk about pattern recognition also, which machines are becoming increasingly, pretty good at it, and in fact better than humans in many cases in the past few years. But if you look at Microsoft Tay's, what happened to Microsoft's bot called Tay over the net, right? It started, basically deep learning means the machine starts off like a baby and you have to sort of like teach it. But will people teach it the wrong things? And can your robots be pilfering, let's say 0.01 cents and transferring from one account to another? Is there an inherent risk in going cognitive? Yeah,
So maybe again for us, there are new jobs being created, right? So there are new jobs that is actually about auditing the rules of the machine. So again, it's a really interesting world. For those of you that watch Westworld, this is actually what is happening, right? So what we now have are auditors are actually now questioning the algorithms that are actually controlling the machines. And yes, errors can happen. Or sometimes, again, we've had the example where, the Gen Ys actually sort of programmed news to actually make us feel sad, right? Again, whether that's manipulative, and again, the rules around what people want to do with our machines now becomes, again, an ethical issue. So there are new jobs that we see happening where we are going to be auditing why did the machine do these things, and as a result of that, then our human intelligence needs to actually come in aided by machines again to actually question the integrity of our bots.
Yeah, so MAS just issued a consultation paper on robo-advisors, and one of the things that it warned the robo-advisors is that in terms of erroneous algorithms being used, so machines also can be manipulated just like humans, I suppose, but we have to have those safeguards. Coming to Gabriel, right? So Weidmuller, is committed to what we call Industry 4.0. And of course, it also says that it is preparing companies for the IoT. Maybe you can talk about Industry 4.0 and also how process automation, right, would evolve in the environment.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. Industry 4.0, it's actually carrying forward a lot of the technology that the world has evolved into over the last 20 years. And what it does, right, is to actually transform machines that are working individually into groups and farms of machines that work together with each other, handing over processes from one machine to another. So a best case example, right, will be if you look at the new BMW plant in Shenyang. BMW has a very, very huge plant in Shenyang, but they've just built a new one where the whole plant is almost a showcase of Industry 4.0. You have virtual reality. People are wearing glasses and doing things, with a prompt in front of you. And these are the kind of technology that you actually need. The Industry 4.0 rather is actually trying to harmonize machines that work separately into farms, and to control these machines remotely as well. So for us, we are in the space, you know, we talk a lot about technology and all, but we forget that you need wires, you need control systems. You have a machine that is 20-year-old, you have a cutting-edge machine. This runs on a very high-end new PLC system. You have a 20-year-old machine that runs, you know, almost on an analog system. All this have to talk. Industry 4.0 is talking also about the connectivity to enable this talking at the first stage. If you look at the PUB plant in Changi, where the wastewater treatment is, it is a huge plant. Okay, let's say, imagine this hotel is that plant. You have a control system in that plant controlling the whole hotel. Industry 4.0 will actually bring it to the next level. Instead of having a control system in the plant, controlling the plant, this control system could be 50 kilometers away. And this is again where the connectivity, the secure routers, and what, you know, Rolf was sharing, the blockchain is so critical to secure the Industry 4.0 connectivity so that you can actually work from centralized locations and do things very differently from the past.
So do you see the blockchain, I mean, you know, the blockchain, what is the relevance of the blockchain? If, you know, is the blockchain part of Industry 4.0? Is it part of the revolution?
Yeah, I would, if just before you, yeah. If we look at the subnext virus that was released in the world many years ago that affected machinery, the main argument was this was created by the Israeli and US intelligence agencies to cripple the Iranian machinery that was very much part of their nuclear program. So the blockchain basically enables then a secure communication that locks out issues like this from destroying, you know, processes that are running. Can you imagine a hospital running with Siemens or Rockwell PLC control systems, and you know, you have an internet that is not so secure. Of course, you can use Weidmuller secure routers, you know, that do this. You know, we guarantee you a safe channel. But then, you know, with blockchain, basically, you are securing and identifying signals that are commanding things that are mission critical.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think blockchain is definitely something that only operates on the digital level, right? So there's no clear way for the blockchain to connect the digital realm with the real physical realm. For that, you need a Wi-Fi signal, you need some kind of device, you need wires, you need kind of machines, right? But as soon as this machine or these wires generate anything that's digital, and you need to identify where signals are coming from, and what is being transferred between different sort of nodes or points of contacts. And you want to assign these things an identity, whether it's your car, whether it's an individual, like an email address, or sort of any other thing that sort of takes an input and produces an output. As soon as you create these swarms or groups of bots, then the blockchain becomes extremely useful for essentially connecting and extracting information out of this swarm. The other thing that I'll say is, you know, in your example where you said the controller was sort of removed from the actual operations, a huge value of the blockchain is that you don't have to run certain operations in-house anymore, right? So you can just run them what we like to call in a decentralized manner, which is sort of outside the organization, which is sort of a new way of thinking, because you would think, listen, if we don't have core processes running within the organization, then maybe we put our organization at risk, right? Some of the processes, maybe it gets hacked, maybe everyone can see what sort of happens within the organization. That's true for certain processes, but not all of them. And for those processes for which it is not true, you can gain huge efficiencies in cost by essentially outsourcing a lot of these processes outside the organizations into sort of this global blockchain.
So do you see the Internet of Things and blockchain interacting more? I mean, is what you're talking about. It's not only digital, it's also physical. Yeah,
I think that's the next frontier, right? So we have the Internet of Things. Right now everyone's talking about connecting devices. Right, but then what do you do once you've connected these devices, right? And then the blockchain is sort of operating independently, which is just in the digital realm. The Internet of Things, what it does, it has lots of things in the real world, and it just connects them. Now they're communicating, right? But you don't really know yet what to do with that. You need some kind of thing like the blockchain, where you can run things like machine learning algorithms and deep learning algorithms, or any kind of RPA, in order to sort of generate analysis and insights out of all the data that IoT generates.
Right. So we are talking about all these different technologies, but they are just different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. We still have to put the puzzle together, and the challenge is really how to look at a business model and see how your business model can maximize the potential of all these technologies. And I think, Professor Samir, you actually look at process innovation and its impact on business model innovations. You see the IoT, the blockchain, you see RPA, you see cognitive RPA. How would you advise people, in terms of looking at that business model and how it should be innovated or transformed?
It's unfair, Joseph. Now you want me to put this all together. So, all right. No, I mean, this is a very valid question. So I'm going to, well, I guess it's a risk that I always had. I'm going to sound like an academic, but I guess that's just true. See, I want to go back to a little bit of to a little bit of history, right? Because I think it's very important, and it links with what Wendy and Timothy talked about in the morning. So if you think about how the world has been moving in terms of innovating on business processes, right? There's a very famous framework by Hales and Wheelwright. Has anybody heard this name, Hales and Wheelwright? All right, so I'll just sum it up very quickly. And they very famously, in 20, 30 years ago, pointed out a trade-off between flexibility and efficiency, right? So essentially what they said was that if you think about the world as a dichotomous world, just for simplicity, so imagine a world where you have very standardized products or highly customized products, right? So that's the product side of the world. And in the process side of the world, again, let's dichotomize it. If you think that you have very flexible processes or very efficient processes, right? What Hayes and Wheelwright showed is that typically you'll see that customized or variable products require very flexible processes, and standardized products require efficient processes, right? So that's kind of the fit between the process and the product. So the world started moving towards, well, what's the difference between flexible and efficient processes? Well, efficient processes are highly cost effective, and flexible processes are essentially going to give you nimbleness or speed. In some sense, you can adapt very quickly, but they're not cost effective. So there is this trade-off, and the best way to balance this trade-off is to see what product category are you talking about. So the world started moving towards standardization because that gave the maximum efficiency, right? So Henry Ford famously said, right, you can get any color car you want as long as it's black, right? And that was the whole movement. So let's go more standardized because that's the way we can get maximum cost efficiency. That was the entire movement of industrial revolution, so to speak. Now came in the require to differentiate because people said this is too competitive and we're competing too much on cost. Right? So they started moving towards differentiation, which essentially meant that they had to go towards more product variety, and you can't just sell black cars anymore. So they started moving towards the other spectrum, and they required to build in flexibility. Now industry, physical product industry, they solved this problem really well. They said we can do things like delayed differentiation, so we'll make vanilla boxes, and every time a customer comes and asks for a different flavor, we'll flavor it in the last minute, right? And we can sell it. So they got a lot of efficiencies from that. The service sector, however, suffered. Right? It is very difficult to create a vanilla box out of a service system unless you can really modularize it, which is not so different. Every customer, every need, every service requirement is very different. And hence service systems are plagued with the fact that they had to build in a lot of slack, a lot of flexibility in the system to adapt for the varying needs of customers. Now where all of this comes together is for the first time we now see the possibility of breaking this trade-off. For the first time, we see the possibility of running an efficient system while catering to the very customized needs that a service environment typically has, right? And why are we able to do this is because we are getting into the world of cognitive computing, right? So if you think about RPA, RPA is a low-hanging fruit, actually. It's good. It's very efficient, but it's not capitalizing on the big money, right? Because it's really optimizing a process which is already very efficient, right? So of course there are gains, but there is not much. It's the other side of the world, which is not efficient, which is where all the customized, highly variable, highly context-specific work happens. And if you can figure out a way to optimize that, that's where the real value is sitting. So why are people investing billions? Because they see the ability, because if I can automate the thinking as much as I can of a human in an environment, then I can actually get both flexibility and efficiency at the same time, and that's quite dramatic. Actually.
So actually, when you say that, what comes to my mind is 3D printing, because 3D printing means that you can send digital instructions to someone elsewhere in another country, and they could take the design and actually customize it. Mass customization is allowed through 3D printing.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about products, right? So moving away from services. In fact, this is very interesting. So, I have a client, I'm not under NDA, so I can name them, BAE Systems, right? So we were talking about 3D printing, and somehow the issue of quality came up, right? Is quality a big deal? And, guy in the audience, he raised his hand, he says, you know what? Quality is not an issue because we 3D print spare parts for fighter jets. So what I can tell you is quality is not a problem, cost is a problem. So 3D printing is a good example of where you can create flexible, hyper-localized manufacturing systems, but they're still very costly right now, and the cost is mostly hardware. So, we know hardware cost is going to go down, 30–40% year on year. That's how quickly hardware kind of becomes cheaper. So your point is, yeah, I mean, what's going to happen to the world of, global manufacturing business? And I don't know, manufacturing firms tomorrow will become design firms, right? They don't have to be manufacturing firms anymore. The way logistics works, it's going to be hyper-localized areas of manufacturing. And if I go back to what Rolf is saying, you're a company that makes something and you sell me a design, the first thing you have to worry about is, well, what if I make multiple copies of that design, right? So, whereas if you sold me a product, it would be one product, right? Well, if you connect the 3D printer to something like a blockchain, it's very easy to verify how many copies I printed for that same design, right? So there are ways to securitize that transaction. So anyway, two very different worlds, but all of these movements somewhat have a common story, and the story is, how can I cater to a highly customized and variable world with relative efficient processes, essentially breaking the Hales and Wheelwright trade-off, which has been operating in the world forever, right? So that's something that we're very familiar with, and now people want to break that trade-off. That's essentially what it is.
So where are we now?
I think we are at the cusp of doing things. I mean, we're making a lot of mistakes. I'll give you a small story. I was working with a client, this is a few years ago, so the technology was not so sophisticated, so take it with a pinch of salt, who was trying to automate a customer service process, okay? And they had a two-tier process. So they had sort of generalists at tier 1, and then they would escalate the customer service call to a specialist at tier 2. And the specialists were really, really good, but slightly expensive. So obviously they wanted to make sure that not much escalation takes place. Now they started to automate, and because technology was not so sophisticated, they started automating the tier 1 process, which, by the way, massively reduced their costs of having tier 1 generalists. But their overall costs dramatically shot up, right? So it was automation gone completely wrong because, again, you have to think about these things carefully. And why did it go wrong is, yes, they got rid of a lot of generalists, but in the process, more calls started getting escalated to experts. So they actually had to hire 20% more experts who are significantly more expensive than the generalists that they were hiring, right? So you have to be a bit careful. So your question is, where are we? And I'm saying we're at the point where we are sort of experimenting. We're dabbling with things. These things are highly erroneous. If any one of you use Grab Taxi or Uber and you sent a message to their customer service, I often send them a message back saying, are you a bot or a human? And the answer is very annoying as well because it doesn't clearly tell me who the person is, right? And I always get the same answer. I live in somehow the GPS system, my condo doesn't show up correctly. So they always end up making a mistake. And when I send a complaint about this, that listen, you may want to tap into the latest API that Google has released, and you're using an API which may be slightly older, I get a response that says, we're working with our drivers, they're working really hard, we'll get back to you soon. And I'm like, I get it, your driver is not making the mistake, it's your GPS which is making the mistake. Well, we're sorry for the inconvenience, hope you'll continue to use our service. That's the standard reply for the last 3 times I've done it.
Does it make a difference to you whether you're talking to a bot or a human?
Well, it depends, right? So there are certain times that I really want to talk to a bot only. But at the end of the day, it all depends on how customized the need is, right? So there are certain things where I really don't want to interact with I want to call in and I want certain things to be done immediately, right? And I don't need a human to do that for me, right? But there are certain things where I have very specific needs, and I don't want those rules to be followed, and I need systems to be smart enough to understand that my needs are slightly different. And that's where I need, as of now, a human to come in. Now, how smart can the technology get it's not clear right now. Now, it's moving exponentially fast, so it will get smarter. But as of now, it's not there. So yes, we are at the cusp. We are still dabbling with it. But we need to understand the economics of our system before we just jump onto technology. I famously used to say this in my classes, that automating a mess will give you an automatic mess. So you have to be very, very careful with how you run around with these things, right?
Okay, very, very articulate, very humorous. Rolf, how does the blockchain impact business models? Because you were raving about monetization. Maybe you can say something about that.
So I guess, I mean, building on what Samir says, right? I mean, it's not just about automating processes. I think one of the things that are interesting with the blockchain is that it makes it sort of things that used to be within an individual organizations, which used to operate more like silos. There are processes that are being automated and put outside the organization, within a network of organizations, and these organizations share the automated process that is outside the organization. The way that's structured leads to cost efficiencies, but it also means that you can now transact things much more easily because you have transparency and there's no centralization of ownership, which means you're sure that no one who's sort of controlling the blockchain, because no one's controlling the blockchain that is sort of outside the organization, you know that there's no conflict of interest, or that you're not afraid that someone's going to change some of the data in that blockchain, particularly because some of the properties of the blockchain make it so that everyone can look into that sort of fancy Excel file that constitutes a blockchain. When we go to monetization, I think that's a sort of a big topic, but one of the things that I'm particularly interested in for the fund that we run is when certain kind of organizations issue the equivalent of shares on a blockchain, right? So it's just a digital form of a share where I say, listen, if you guys want to buy into Rolf Corporation, I'm going to issue 100 Rolf coins. You know, I'm going to send it to you in exchange for money. You send me $1 per coin. I sort of raise $100. With that $100, I'm going to automate certain processes, you know, the whole finance department in all your organizations. And after I've built that sort of robot, if you like, and I've put it on the blockchain, then the only way to use that robot is for someone else to use some of the coins. So it goes back to the vending machine example, which is if the vending machine is sort of the smart contract or robot, the only way to use it is to use a specific kind of coin. The only coin you can use is the Rolf coin. Therefore, the people who initially gave me money in exchange for my Rolf coins are going to make money for anyone who wants to use that smart contract, by way of basically buying off the coins from the initial adopters. And then you have an ecosystem where these coins, which are kind of like shares, but kind of like product licenses as well, sort of start to become native to this smart contract or robot, where Rolf doesn't have any interest in it anymore once it's built. I sort of put myself out of business. I just become an organization that builds an automatic kind of robot for other people to use.
Yeah, the DAO, the digital.
Let me just add to this a little bit. Let me give you two small examples, which are actually much simpler than the examples that Rolf gave, because they don't, I mean, Rolf's examples are actually very valid, but they require a lot of technology forwardness, right? A lot of people need to understand how these things work. But I'll tell you some very simple innovations that are happening as we speak on the blockchain, where blockchain is not even fundamentally needed for this, but blockchain adds a layer of security, which is why it's doing it, or any automated system can do this. Regulators are not on board right now, but there is an industry which is trying to tap into this and convincing regulators to get on board, which is the insurance industry. So work with me a little bit, okay? We're going to do some hypothetics, but just imagine that this is going to happen as long as the regulators sign off. You sit in your car, okay? Your car, and the minute you get in your car, you essentially put on your cell phone and you put in coordinates of where you want to travel. So you say, I'm sitting here in Park Royal and now I want to go to, I don't know, Tanjung Pagar. So you put in the GPS address, and the minute you put in that there, an insurance message pops up. So you don't have car insurance because your car was in the parking lot. And now an insurance message pops up, and government requires you to buy insurance when you're driving, not when you're in the parking lot. Or let's assume the parking lot rate is separate, which you bought anyway. But now you're going to be on the road, so you need to buy new insurance. And a message pops up and says, do you want to buy this insurance? Which is for this trip that you're going to make from this hotel to your office in Tanjung Pagar. Make sense? Now, you decide whether you want to buy it or not. Okay? You may have other options, and this is all happening through the blockchain. So independent peer-to-peer insurance providers can kind of make me an offer. I buy that insurance, and now the blockchain keeps track of me sticking to the trip because I bought that insurance for the trip. The minute I make deviations from a trip, that's breach of contract. And a smart contract will actually reprice that insurance the minute I deviate from the GPS bridge. IoT comes in because IoT is keeping track of the fact that my car and my cell phone are moving together. So it's not as if I'm buying insurance for some other car, which could be a much more expensive car, for example. It is perfectly well known that, and people can verify this information, that we are moving together at the same time, and that's microinsurance. Now this is going to completely, it's a very simple business model, but as you can imagine, if regulators get on board, this can completely disrupt the world of insurance. Absolutely, right? And especially if individuals like you and I can sell insurance, because all we're going to do is we're going to use blockchain to create a peer-to-peer system to pay for that insurance. We don't even need big pockets, and probably get somebody else to underwrite it on the chain itself, right? So we can do this. Now, a second example, which is also going to happen very soon, is, imagine you buy, Joseph, an autonomous vehicle. And it's going to happen, we know that, right? In the next 10 years, we're going to have autonomous vehicles in the road, if not earlier. If you ever come to our campus, by the way, that's the Singapore's dedicated zone of autonomous vehicle testing. So if you're a little bit of an adventurous person, you should hang around. Anyway, so you buy an autonomous vehicle, you register it on blockchain. And you basically write a smart contract there that says, you know what, when the car is not being used by me, which is very easy to verify because, again, the phone and the car will not be at the same place, anybody with a Singapore phone, because I trust people with a Singapore phone, can use my car. And here is the pricing points and traffic intensity, et cetera, of how this is going to get priced. So you get off your car, and it drops you in your office, and I'm looking for a ride. So I look on the phone, and I call for a car that comes and picks me up. And again, the entire thing will be verified because my phone and the car will move from the point I put as the destination up to the point, the point I put up as a pickup, up to the point where I mention my destination. And I get dropped off at that point, and then the car and the phone separate, which again gets verified. And that's when an automatic payment gets triggered from my account to yours, which also happens seamlessly on this system. This is a completely disruptive business model. Again, if regulators get on top of this, as you can imagine, this can disrupt the disruptors, right? So next thing you know, Uber and Grab are out of business, right? And this is Rolf's point of creating decentralized organizations altogether. I mean, in some sense, this is a completely decentralized organization where the chain is facilitating all transactions, right? So that's how I think business models and technologies sort of interact with each other, and a lot of disruption can take place.
Okay, so now let's come to the troubling question. Okay, Timothy was talking about shared services. Okay, but we are all thinking about what's going to happen to offshore shared services center, right? The facts are these. I think Deloitte published a report in 2015 on robots are coming, and it estimated that a robot is actually, the cost of a robot is only 1/3 of an FTE in an offshore SSC, a shared service center. It also points out in the report that the cost savings that you can get from a robot, right, exceeds okay, what cost savings you can get from moving your finance operations overseas or offshore. And it also makes the point that the finance functions that will be most be disrupted and have the most potential of being automated is actually mostly in the shared services center. Okay, so quite ominous kind of statistics, and you just wonder what's going to happen to shared services centers by 2025. Where will they go? The question that we have is, okay, if you can automate it in Singapore, why do you need automation in India or Indonesia, right? And I was just starting to imagine where will they go, and I think shared service centers will be deep in the sea, okay, by 2025. The reason is because, just like the data centers today, they are deep in the sea. You've got shared service centers with bots and chatbots, basically manning the whole processes. And, you just wonder then what's going to happen to the economies of Philippines or India and so on and so forth, where the jobs so-called go back to the US, right? Of course, Trump may or may not be happy because it may go back to the US, but it will not go back to the Americans. It will go back to the robots. You're insourcing back to the robots. So maybe Wendy, you have something to say about that?
Yeah, and we have actually seen our latest sort of shared services survey that quite a few of, if you've got an offshore location, they are actually bringing, especially in the US and the UK, they're bringing those functions back. Yeah. And again, I want to just pick up what Samir has also said about, like for us, automation is actually a race to the bottom. Right, again, so by that we mean it doesn't give you a competitive advantage. In fact, in the old days in the service industry, if you were a cost leader, actually not having robotics pays to your strength because you have kept the intelligence of why you've been a cost leader in your organization. Once you have a robot, 24/7 of these things, and again, they are able to be shared, you're losing a competitive advantage. Okay, so for us, these things are actually impacting our shared services of the future. And what we're also seeing happening is that we're now moving, though, into these centers of expertise, centers of excellence, your specialized finance roles. So, it does call for maybe a different type of skill. It calls for a transition. It does actually, again, what I talked about in terms of generational, we're looking for not repetitive, but insights. And we again have to be able to teach some of these things in our universities and academies today. And it's not just about learning rule-based ways of working. It is the why. Why are you doing it this way? When you see exceptions, why is it that you actually need to go through and do something different? So we are seeing that change. We're seeing shared services becoming different. Again, maybe it's the aspiration that we had with shared services in GBS. They were always meant to actually be higher intelligent, but we never used them as such. They were dumb factories in some ways, right? So that is going to change. And then what we are seeing is that organizations should not be thinking about shared services and transactional finance in isolation of the other functions within finance itself, which is why, again, when we talk about shared services, we are talking about where you're going to go with your business finance roles, where you're going to go with your specialized finance roles, because you have to actually reconstitute the way that your operating model needs to work.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll come back to you, Gabriel, but I would like to ask the audience whether they have any questions while we are doing this, and you just raise your hand and a mic will come to you. So Gabriel, please.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to what Wendy said, in my previous job, I had the pleasure of running a €1 billion APAC shared services, and a lot of shared services, it was just like she was sharing, it was a race to the bottom. And in the process of the race to the bottom, countries like Singapore, the high-cost countries, were losing processing jobs. So the processing jobs left to human processors in other countries. With RPA, there is actually then the opportunity for high-cost countries like Singapore to embrace technology and to actually be in the forefront of robotization of transactions. And in that way, the jobs that left Singapore will never, ever, ever come back to Singapore. And those jobs in the Philippines, Romania, and all are now at actually very high risk because of robotization. So the opportunity actually, there are two sides of the coin. One is, it will the processing jobs will be replaced by robots, but at the same time, with the accounting knowledge of the finance industry, as well as the technical skills, there is that opportunity to actually be the next shared services of the world, technologically driven, robotized shared services of the world. So the shared services, as we've known it, is, to me, it's at the end of its life cycle, and what we need to be is actually embracing the new one, which is robots. Because either way, those jobs are gone. And if you are having people running those jobs, then you become very, very uncompetitive globally. And it's a chicken and egg kind of problem.
So are there any questions from the floor? A lot of troubling questions, a lot of changes in your lives are going to occur in your working environment. Anything, or maybe you think that shared services will actually proliferate and become, even bigger because of RPA and so on and so forth. So Gabriel was almost going to say, talk about, you're almost going to mention about this generation of robots coming into the workplace, right? So Vineka was talking about multi-generational humans, right? You have so many different types of robots now. You got the basic robot, right, without cognitive. Then you got the autonomic. Then you got the cognitive. So you got even among the robots, you have different generations. So you have multi-generational humans working with multi-generational robots. So are there any questions? Okay, so basically, one of the findings in the survey that Vineka shared was that Gen X was more, interested in the latest technology and stuff like that. It's because as what she said, it is counterintuitive. So were you surprised by the fact that Gen X rather than Gen Y or Gen Z was more technologically, I wouldn't say savvy, but accepting than Gen Y or Gen Z. Did you find the results of the survey, surprising, as it were?
I think it's an interesting result. I think the way that I might interpret that result is to say that, so I'm Gen Y. I don't really care how things work. I care about what they do to me, right? So right. I go into an airplane. I don't care about the technology running the airplane. I just want it to be convenient. I just want it to work for me, right? And I think it's the same sort of with other technologies and robots. I don't want to know if there's a robot on the other side of Hoefer. I just want to know that it's going to solve my problem, whether it's a human being or a bot. And whoever or whatever does that the fastest, that's sort of what I'm interested in. Oh. So perhaps somewhat ecocentric, but it's sort of the same with I think ideas of the blockchain or sharing services, where you say that you are essentially outsourcing costs, and then there's some robots. With the blockchain, it sort of says that sharing services shouldn't belong to a specific jurisdiction. It's sort of generally all digital, right? So it doesn't matter where it is. And once you've built the robot, it sort of works on its own. But what I care about is not even all this kind of technological sort of outsourcing stuff, cost reduction stuff. I care how an organization is going to turn this cost reduction or this outsourcing of certain sets of processes into a value proposition for me. And what I really care about is how this cost reduction either means that I pay less, or that I get paid more, right, or that it's just more convenient for me.
You're speaking exactly like a Gen Y.
So I can, you see, we see a lot of senior executives in our programs every year, thousands of them actually, which would arguably belong to Gen X. So I can share a little bit about why I'm not surprised. In fact, it's good to see this result. It does break a kind of a stereotype that we have, but actually if you think about it, it sort of makes sense, and I'll tell you why. See, I don't think we've ever seen, so we've always seen innovation, right? Technology innovation, we've seen massive technology breakthroughs in this world, right? So what is different about this wave of technology breakthrough? And I think it's a very important question to ask. And if you think about it, what's really different, at least the way I look at it, is that many times technology innovations used to happen in a vertical, right? So if you think about the automobile industry, right? They improved the engine, they improved the carburetor, or they changed the fuel injection system, etc. It was all innovation in one vertical. So that vertical was interested in it, and they knew a lot about it. Now, if you think about the innovation, I mean, these are happening as a complete ecosystem, right? These are not in the same vertical. Sticking to the to the car industry, if you think about it, what are the innovations? They're talking about autonomous cars, which has a lot to do with quantum computing, has a lot to do with IoT, has a lot to do with algorithms, and has a lot to do with AI, artificial intelligence. There are electric cars, which is all about battery technology, right? Which came about from non-automobile companies, which actually really innovated on the battery technology, and business models that people are dabbling with. They have connected cars, which is a completely different ecosystem which came outside of the automotive industry, right? And they have the shared economy, which is completely disrupting the ownership model which exists in the car industry, where the Gen Ys, the millennials, don't want to own things, right? So they're very happy sharing cars, and they're actually very keen on doing that more than actually ownership of cars. So if you think about all the disruptions that are happening in this one example that I picked up, many of them are happening outside of their vertical. What does that mean? Well, we actually see senior executives that walk through our corridors, that no matter what industry they come from, all of them right now have a huge sense of urgency that no matter what industry they belong to, they are or have already or very soon will get disrupted. And I think the sense of urgency requires them to basically accept it and then embrace it, right? And what you see in the survey, the way at least I read the results, is that these are a bunch of executives who've now realized that this is something that I can ignore and then be obsolete, or I can tackle this head on. And I'm guessing the results that you're seeing is that there is this intent to tackle this head on, because the generation X that you're talking about, it's too early for them to say we're done for now, right? And
I would just like to add that most of the big technology companies the founders were actually Gen X, right? And I know, just to tell Gen Y that we are also a bit technologically savvy. But yeah, going back to the question, James, maybe you were talking about IoT. Maybe if you have any comments on.
Yeah, Thank you. I think it's exciting hearing all this. My point is, it seems that we are at the conversion of sharing economy, Industrial 4.0, robotic, IoT, because it's going to change the whole landscape, not just finance, but it's also very much like Rolf mentioned, it changed the front end of doing business. You know, like a simple example I shared with JJ earlier is like, currently probably we are still buying our own fridges at home. But with all this conversion, we no longer need to buy our fridge. Basically, whether Hitachi, Samsung, who provide you the fridge that is enabled with the blockchain, with the IoT, is all the business partner that is in this supply chain essentially is paying for your fridge. Then you give us a convenience of, I don't even have to remember what I need to stock up. I don't have to remember what brand of milk I like. I don't have to worry about out of stock. So that's why it's exciting. It's not just finance. It's the whole ecosystem have changed to allow business to be transacted from a B to a very detailed individual consumer level. But I believe there's a lot of development going on. So whichever generation, we have to embrace it and make it happen.
Thanks.
Yeah, and to me, just to add a little bit to what James said, you know, and bring it back to the CFO context that we all are, it's actually the challenge of looking forward and seeing what is going to make our companies obsolete, or what it takes to keep our company running into the next generation. So it's important to have that foresight looking forward.
Actually, I'm glad you brought this up, since we have mostly finance folks here, right? That's what I understand. Actually, I just a little bit more philosophical point. I completely agree with you that businesses are going to fundamentally change. The front end of every business is going to change. And, you know, somewhere there was this question about, you know, is the finance department going through a redundancy risk, right? I actually think it's a huge opportunity. The businesses that that run in the front are going to fundamentally change. This gives you a unique opportunity to now play a more embedded role in the front end of the business, where the back end of the business can be completely made transactional, right? So finance can actually, because everything, if Hitachi is no longer going to sell the fridge, their entire business model is changing. The way their entire finance and the way their operations are going to run is going to fundamentally change. So this is actually an opportunity for the CFO to actually have a very powerful seat at the strategy table. But not just by looking at the books, by actually being a part of the new business model, right? So it's actually a pretty dramatic change.
And maybe I'll just add to this also. I mean, what I do see is that organizations are actually, they're digitizing their existing way of working, which is not a business model change, right? That we're making, you know, things that we do, and banking is a great example of this, by the way, despite blockchain, because it's really hard for you to disrupt yourself, right? Because your income and the way that you're currently generating revenue is the way that you currently do business, right? So it's very hard to disrupt, you know, your own vertical. But what are then, you know, is whether we believe or you believe that your business is actually going to be disrupted or not. And I think if you do, then again, digital and what its impact changes totally. And I still see sometimes we don't want to actually embrace it. It's hard, right? And so again, maybe as finance leaders, is really, again, opening up to, again, convergence and what, you know, again, you know, in your own industry, it will look the same. No one will actually want to actually disrupt the way you're currently making money, but someone outside will do so. And then I'm going to talk about, again, G Digital with the industrial internet. What they're doing is actually, again, you know, they want to own the industrial internet. Again, can you imagine a world where you don't own any assets whatsoever? They've done that with their engineering, you know, for the aircrafts, right? So again, it's by minute, right? So rather than you having to actually replace your engines at a planned maintenance cycle, they've got IoT that can track, and they know, and they will replace specific parts, you know, and they're now going to a new area of business that is totally disrupting their current revenues, but it's opening up new revenues and new opportunities again. So I suppose, you know, I would challenge all of you to think about your own industry and say, what is your response? You know, are we just digitizing the way that we currently work, or do we definitely think that there is something coming around the corner and you need to be more prepared for that future?
Great, thanks. So maybe just one last question before you conclude, if you want to. Does anybody want to? Vincent, is it?
I have. Right, I have one comment and one question. On comments on the fridge, I don't think maybe in 10 years' time there's a fridge available, because fresh food will be provided to you anytime you want, and maybe another 10 years later, you don't need food. You only need a cuisine, right? You just live on a drip. I think that is where the technology
okay, this is
going.
really way out.
But anyway, joking aside, my question is more about, back to the key topic of today is finance processes. Well, regardless it's a RPA or RCA, for finance, where should we start? How can we start? Do I need to engage a consultant to start to review my process? Do I need to buy software, hardware, or what? It's a good concept. It's inevitable. It's in the future. But where can I start?
Wendy, where?
I was joking by saying yes, of course, and really the answer is really I don't think it is, right. I think what we're finding in, again, our consultancy businesses is different ways of actually working. You need to actually be more informed, right? So part of this is actually being here and doing your own exploration. I believe very much that you have to be curious, right? That is one of the traits that we think is important going forward. Then I would also say you should surround yourself by asking questions, right? And these things don't have to be paid for, right? Again, if I think about our firm, the things that we're interested in, we like the opportunity to actually explore and work, and we will find new ways of actually, finding new profit pools. So I would say ask questions. You need to find out what other people are doing, because these things, again, some of the concepts that we're talking about, we don't have to invent them here. Then I do think there's a conversation in your organization that you actually do need to have. What is the future of finance? What do you think is important if you think about all the things that we've talked about that is actually important to do? And then last thing I would say is that we do things very much in, agile ways, right? Don't go for long engagements and long things, because you need to learn. So again, I would say, can you break things down into 8-week chunks, right? Sprints, as we call them, so you can learn as you go, and you're using that to actually inform your decisions.
Yeah, can I, if I can fast forward and imagine you're asking me this question 5 years later, by then I can answer you, because the next generation of accountants that graduate from schools need to have at least a very strong base in technology. As accountants, we studied, maybe the technology was 10% of our syllabus, but the next generation, so I'm answering you 5 years forward, is actually you have no problem, because the new accountants, their syllabuses were been adjusted so that technology is maybe about 30% of their education, because accounting and technology cannot be separated anymore in the future.
Thank you, Gabriel. So in the interest of time, this is definitely the last question.
But can I just very quickly add just one more point? I'll tell you why, because I think you raised a very important point. It's not just where you started. I think there's an opportunity here. So where you start, to me, is to do an audit of your processes to begin with, right? Before you start talking about automation. And many often when I do some work with executives, I ask them, why are you doing certain things? And the most common answer I get, right, is because that's the way we've always done it. So this is actually a great time to start really thinking about your entire process blueprint and try to see, how do you run your processes before you even get into the thinking of automation and, going into that direction. Mm-hmm. So my starting point would be a process audit, to be very honest with you.
Thank you.
Hello. I think from my perspective, the reason why we are more interested in the advancement of the technology is it solves two problems. One, visibility and the reduction of human errors that we see sometimes in our accounting. With the information being more available, do you think that there's a risk that we'll be overly reactionary to little blimps that we're having with the new information? And as finance advisors, how do we avoid that trap?
Too much of information, too sensitized. Do we become undersensitized, or or do we become more sensitive because of more information?
That's an interesting question. To me, this whole talk about the big data then comes into play. It's really how to use the big data and to have systems and processes to filter out what is relevant. Because basically what's happening with big data, or the talk of big data, is you suddenly have an explosion of information, and you can very easily drown in it. So that's where, again, I'm promoting CFOs. Where CFOs have an important role is to really sieve out and filter what then becomes relevant and usable data. And to filter out the rest, and using maybe software applications and business sense to do that.
Okay, thank you, Gabriel.
I'm not. So I think the way I understand your question is, and it's connecting back to the earlier question, is sort of you have to have a strategic objective, right? So if you do an audit of the existing processes, you've got to know what is it that we want to sort of outsource or put into some kind of service center, and then that's the kind of data that you gather. Those are the kinds of robots that you build. Because if you sort of just look at all the stuff that you can gather, you'll just be inundated, right? There's just way too much stuff that you can do. There's even way too many robots, right? If you look at all the kinds of robots. So the best way is, where do I want to be in 5 years? You walk backwards today. What's my kind of competitive advantage? If technology is just sort of a race to the bottom, then you have to say, look, technology is not going to be a differentiator anymore. What's going to be a differentiator? And then once you sort of have that differentiation, maybe then you know where to look when it comes to what robots to sort of build or use, and what kind of information to gather and what information not to gather.
Okay, great. So can I just ask the panel for your concluding thoughts, starting with Rob and him, sort of coming through here. Anything on process automation, or anything on what's going to happen in the next 5 years?
I think, generally the point remains, process automation is going to be on the rise. I think the big question, I guess from a very high level, is we don't have a problem of gathering data anymore. It's really the question, what kind of data to look at. So selecting among a huge mass of data, that's what's really becoming important, right? Whether you look at the news in the morning, whether you think about what business processes to outsource, what business processes to automate or not. And so I think that is, generally speaking, the challenge from a Gen Y perspective, right, who only wants to be fed the most important information and no sort of extraneous stuff that I don't care about.
Okay, Wendy.
Maybe I'll just reiterate my final slide that I already have. I do think I'm very optimistic, right? But again, I want to come back. William Gibson said again, the future is here, but it's unevenly distributed, right? So there's parts of us that are actually able to actually take advantage of this future, and there's also a lot of us that are not. And I think, again, we just need to, think about the journey that we want to actually take as, again, leaders and as human beings, and also in this society that we actually live in. And I believe that we will find a way forward that will allow us to marry the machine, the age of the machine, and the age of actually, our humanity.
I think for me, the most important thing here, especially given this audience, is that, technology as a race to the bottom is the first thing that jumps at us. It's a natural thing. But I also think that you should flip it around and see if technology is a way to innovate, right? So if technology gives you a capability of kind of completely changing your business model, completely changing your processes, as a way to actually create value. So I'll give you a quick example, okay? Netflix. Netflix completely took over Blockbuster's business in the US by a simple technology which is not their own, right? Which is DVDs. Why? Because DVDs could fit into a mailbox, and videotapes could not fit into a mailbox. So the minute DVDs came about, Netflix actually completely swarmed the market, of course using the internet as well as DVDs, and took it away. And when the second technology wave came in, which is broadband, Netflix again just switched everybody from DVDs to streaming, right? Both these technologies were not Netflix owned, or Netflix didn't have anything to do with them. So you can leverage technology to fundamentally challenge existing business models in the market. And then I want to hook it back to what Wendy said, that fundamentally challenging business models doesn't mean you have to create a new business model. Many times I call this Renaissance innovation. This is not really innovation. The GE aviation example, where you're paying for each use of the engine, That's what Xerox did 20, 30 years ago, where you stop buying their machines and start paying them for photocopies, right? These are renaissance. These are copycat innovation models. They simply haven't been used in the context because technology didn't exist that would allow you to figure out how to charge on a pay-per-use basis for an engine, for example, right? So think of technology as an enabler for you to fundamentally change business models, and you get out of the mindset of race to the bottom, because I think it's a bit dangerous there.
Gabriel?
Yeah, for me, I guess the most important message is, to really read the market and see disruptive innovation in a positive light as not really destroying our jobs, but how it can enable us to remain competitive. And if you look at the Netflix example, just yesterday, Australian TV announced that Channel 10 will close down. Why? Because Netflix swamped it. It swamped it, and the whole business model wiped it out. And what happens now to DBS, OCBC Bank, and UOB? Have you heard of Alibaba Finance? Okay, Google Finance. Those could be the next two banks that are running in Singapore if we do not take a knife and cut ourselves, early and start to fix ourselves. Yeah, and don't bleed to death in the process,
Yeah, I would just like to say, coming back to the topic of robotic process automation, is that looking at process automation not in isolation, not in a vacuum, but really looking at all the looking at the whole ecosystem of technologies and platforms that process automation will interact. And today RPA is only at a very, very basic level. In 5 years' time, it's going to be really smart with cognitive elements in it and interacting with the blockchain, IoT and so on and so forth. So a lot of exciting things that are coming up. So with that, I'd like to thank the panel. Can you join me in thanking the panel for the sharing and insight? Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Gabriel.